Good evening and welcome to the African Diaspora News Channel. I'm Whitney Mckoy. So today, African leaders are making a major push to classify colonialism as a crime against humanity and also to demand formal reparations for the century of violence, exploitation, and dispossession endured across the continent. Let's get into this.
Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo on Tuesday called for a united front with African leaders on demands for reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonial-era damages. Some Western leaders have recently moved to acknowledge the wrongs of the colonial era in Africa, and museums have begun returning stolen African treasures and artifacts.
No amount of money can restore the damage caused by the transatlantic slave trade and its consequences, which have spanned many centuries. But surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore.
Ghana's leader has been vocal in calling for reparations and used a speech to the UN General Assembly this year to demand for more acknowledgement of the impact of colonial exploitation.
And even before these discussions on reparations conclude, the entire continent of Africa deserves a formal apology from the European nations involved in the slave trade.
Akufo-Addo called on Africa to work together with the Caribbean to advance reparations, labeling it valid demand for justice.
The effects of the slave trade have been devastating to the continent and to the African diaspora. The entire period of slavery meant that our progress, economically, culturally, and psychologically, was stuck.
While the debate over reparations for slavery is still developing, the restoration of stolen treasures and artifacts has steadily advanced.
At a high-level conference in Algiers, diplomats and heads of states gathered to advance an African Union plan aimed at securing justice and restitution for colonial-era crimes. Algeria's Foreign Minister Ahmed Attaf delivered the strongest message of the summit. He said Africa is entitled to official and explicit recognition of the crimes committed against its people during the colonial period. And he made it clear reparations must never be treated as a favor, but as a legal right. Attaf added that the legacy of colonialism is still costing African nations dearly, fueling exclusion, marginalization, and widespread economic setbacks. While international law now prohibits slavery, torture, apartheid, and the seizure of territory by force, the United Nations Charter still does not explicitly reference colonialism. So African leaders argue that this omission continues to protect former colonial powers from accountability.
African leaders meeting in Algiers on Sunday called for colonial-era crimes to be formally recognised, criminalised and compensated for through an African Union-backed reparations process. The AU resolution was passed at a summit in May that pushed to define colonisation as a crime against humanity. Participants stressed the massive economic damage done by colonisation in Africa as European powers plundered the continent's natural resources, leaving communities impoverished. Algeria's Foreign Minister Ahmed Attaf said hosting the meeting in his country was symbolic, given Algeria's experience under French rule. Nearly 1 million French settlers held greater political and economic privileges than Algerians, even though Algeria was legally part of France. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians died in the country's war of independence. In 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron described elements of French colonial history as a crime against humanity, but he stopped short of issuing a formal apology.
Economists estimate that the economic cost of colonialism in Africa reaches into the trillions. European powers extracted enormous wealth from gold and rubber to diamonds and agricultural products, often through brutal and coercive systems. These resources fueled European prosperity, while leaving African nations impoverished for generations. Today, African states are also demanding the return of thousands of looted artifacts still displayed in European museums. The conference location was definitely no accident. Algeria endured some of the most violent forms of French colonial rule. Nearly 1 million European settlers held greater political and economic privileges even while Algerians were conscripted into France's war. The independence struggle from 1954 to 1962 left hundreds of thousands dead and included widespread torture, disappearances, and the destruction of entire villages. Attaf said Algeria's painful history stands as a powerful example of the violent nature of colonialism. He also pointed to Western Sahara, calling it Africa's last colony. Algeria reaffirmed its support for the Sahrawi people and their right to speak determination, a position backed by the African Union, of course, even as more member states shift towards supporting Morocco's claim to the territory. The issue of reparations remains politically sensitive in France. President Emmanuel Macron has admitted that elements of France's history in Algeria amount to a crime against humanity. But France has stopped short of issuing an official apology, and Algerian artifacts, including the historic Canaan Baba Merzoug, have still not been returned. Algerian lawmakers insist any compensation must be meaningful and not just symbolic. This movement is also gaining momentum out here in the Caribbean because regional leaders are calling for formal apologies, financial reparations, and the return of cultural property taken during slavery and colonial rule. A Caribbean delegation is preparing to travel to the UK to press these demands directly. With Africa and the Caribbean now aligning their efforts, the call for accountability is growing louder, and global pressure is mounting for former colonial powers to confront and compensate for the long endurance of us here in the Caribbean and Africa and all around the diaspora, what we went through under their colonial rule. So, we see the fight for reparations expanding to even Africa. We're doing it here in the Caribbean. That's what CARICOM is for. Or, well, that's one of CARICOM's on CARICOM's major agenda at the moment. We see the call for it over in the US, and now we're seeing it in Africa. This is what I love to see. Diaspora coming together, all fighting for one common cause. For the African Diaspora News Channel, I'm Whitney Mckoy. Until next time, stay informed, stay connected.